He couldn't sit, he couldn't swallow, he could barely talk.
As time progressed through the night, the more paralyzed I got.
A physician came into my room and he immediately asked me if I had done drugs while I was pregnant.
We were scared. Maybe they're going to tell us something we may not know how to deal with.
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. When Bob Williams wakes up blind in one eye, it's the most frightening moment of his life. But little does he know it's only the beginning of a terrifying journey that will test both the patient and his family in ways they could never have imagined.
They figured his chances were less than 50%.
Then, from the day Ryan Poteet is born, doctors are completely baffled by his strange appearance. And it isn't long before his parents are forced to face a grim reality.
None of us knew what to expect for the future.
When illness strikes, we look to doctors to give us answers. But what if they can't? For these unlucky patients, diagnosis is a mystery. In 2008, 55-year-old Bob Williams and his wife Sherry were happily married and living in Columbus, Ohio, with their daughter Emily, a freshman at a local university.
I've known Bob for 36 years, and we met when I was 16, he was 20, and have pretty much been inseparable since then.
I live at home with my parents, mostly because I'm an only child, and we've been so close throughout my whole life.
Devoted as Bob is to his family, he's just as dedicated to his job teaching at the neighborhood middle school.
I taught for a total of 23 years without a day off, not even a personal day.
He always got the perfect attendance certificate at the teacher's banquet because he never took a day off.
But in April 2008, Bob wakes up in the middle of the night, exhausted and restless.
I felt pretty good when I went to bed. And then during the night, I would get really cold. And I'd wake up and find out the reason I'm cold is because everything around me was wet from sweat.
All the sheets all the way down to the mattress pad were completely wet.
That was very, very unusual. It never happened to me before in my life.
This went on for 3 or 4, 5 nights, and he was very restless. He was very hot. He obviously had a fever when I felt his forehead.
But little does Bob realize that the high fever and bizarre night sweats are just the beginning of an unnerving series of symptoms.
Halfway through that term of night sweats, I got the headaches.
He had never complained about having headaches so severe and so constant before. And in fact, he even said to me, I feel like just cutting my head off. It hurts so bad.
As painful as the headaches are, Bob still shows up to work every day and refuses to see a doctor.
Bob is a stubborn guy and wasn't used to putting his health in the hands of others than himself.
Sherry tries not to read too much into the situation, but she's worried about her husband, particularly when a strange new symptom begins to emerge.
During the headaches, I started getting light sensitivity. The first time it happened to me, I was on my way home. The sun was, going down and things were very bright, and I was wondering why it hurt my eyes. By the time I got home, I had to wear sunglasses because any light hurt my eyes.
He was in the living room with all of the curtains drawn, with sunglasses on, I think watching TV.
My eyes felt like I was looking into the sun. It just was too much for it.
For more than 2 weeks, Bob lives with a strange constellation of symptoms. And when Sherry can't take seeing her husband suffer any longer, she finally convinces him to take his first day off in 20 years.
I finally called in sick for the first time because my wife said, you need to see the doctor.
Bob makes an appointment with his general practitioner, who performs a thorough head-to-toe exam and takes detailed notes on his symptoms. But the doctor's confident that Bob's simply suffering from a case of the flu.
My doctor convinced me that it was just some kind of cold or flu. I've had the flu before and certainly had the cold, and I felt a lot worse than that. So I had a feeling there could have been something else, and maybe the doctor just didn't get the whole picture.
He was asked to go home and rest a couple of days, take painkiller for the headache, and he should be all fixed up and ready to go back to work in a few days.
2 days later, Bob begins to feel better and heads back to work. Then, when he least expects it, something completely bizarre happens.
My eye started to look really funny, like drooping. All I know is I didn't look very good.
And Bob isn't the only one who notices the startling change in his appearance.
I remember his eye just looking terrible. It shocked me.
His left eye started to droop, which is not something that would be indicative of any kind of a cold or a flu. This was something much more serious.
Sherry pleads with her husband to call their family doctor. But when he does, Bob isn't prepared for what the doctor orders.
He said, "You need to get to the ER."
Alarmed by the sudden turn of events, Bob's family rushes him to the closest emergency room.
The ER doctor quickly looked at my eye and he said, "That's a concern."
Bob's drooping eye, combined with his fatigue, excruciating headaches, and puzzling sensitivity to light, suggests to the ER doctor that he has meningitis, a potentially dangerous inflammation of the brain or spinal cord. The doctor immediately orders a spinal tap to confirm his suspicions. If the infection is bacterial as opposed to viral, Bob could be in real trouble.
It was a viral kind of meningitis. The doctor said that the only treatment was to take a prescription painkiller for the splitting headache, and off we went home for him to recover.
Anxious to get back to work, Bob takes the painkillers as ordered and does his best to try and relax. After a few days, he's certain that the worst is over. Then things take another turn.
Everything was okay until Saturday morning. When I got up, my legs were a little bit wobbly and I was a little shaky, and my eye had this like big black cloud in the middle where I look.
I was at the computer in the morning doing some work, and he walked down the stairs and said, "Sherry, I can't see out of my left eye."
Bob Williams has just been told he's suffering from a severe case of meningitis. Still, the doctors have assured him that once the virus runs its course, he'll feel like his old self again. But just when Bob thinks he's in the clear, he suddenly begins to lose vision in his left eye. In a state of panic, his wife Sherry drives as fast as she can to the emergency room.
As we drove to the emergency room, he was very subtly declining in his speech and in his movement.
By the time we got to the hospital, my eye was not good. There's like a black cloud all around that middle part, and I can only see the very edges of that, and very dimly. The ER physician on duty tested my eye with just handheld tester. And he noticed that the light was on there and I couldn't even see the light.
I guess they figured the meningitis may have spread to other parts of his body or was not under control.
The on-call doctor admits Bob to the hospital. He then orders a series of blood tests and immediately begins administering an antiviral drug in an attempt to get the meningitis in check. But despite the doctor's best efforts, Bob's condition is quickly spiraling out of control.
He couldn't even sit, he couldn't swallow, he could barely talk, and he was very disoriented. So at this point, Emily and I and Bob were very worried about what this might be and what could be done.
and I told him to look straight at me. I said, "Hey Dad, what's going on? How are you? How are you feeling?" And he didn't look at me. I was afraid of my dad losing his eyesight.
The doctor is completely baffled. In a matter of hours, Bob's become partially blind, and it isn't long before a terrifying new symptom begins to set in: paralysis.
My dad couldn't feel his left side. He couldn't walk, he couldn't move his left arm. He had a droopy left side of his face now, not just his eye. His lips were down.
His doctors were much more concerned that this was more than meningitis and ordered an MRI for his brain to check to see if it was a stroke.
When I got down for the MRI, I couldn't even get on the table. They had to lift me onto the table. And when I came out of the MRI, I couldn't snap my fingers on my left side. And I didn't know why. They didn't know what was happening to me, and they didn't know whether I had an infectious disease or whether or not I had something else.
At this point, I don't think anyone who knew what it was. Nobody had a diagnosis as to what it might be or what they might do for it.
A couple of hours later, the MRI results come in. They show nothing out of the ordinary, though it's clear that Bob has not had a stroke. However, his blood tests reveal a startling problem. Bob's white blood cell count is excessively high, indicating that his body is working hard to fight an infection. As a next step, they move him to the intensive care unit, where a team of infectious disease specialists begin testing Bob for a litany of diseases.
Our neurologist was afraid that it could be some sort of rare disease that was taking over my dad's brain, wreaking havoc in his body.
But with no diagnosis in hand and Bob's condition declining by the minute, the family is forced to face some very grim facts.
We had heard outside the ICU a couple of the doctors talking about, well, what's going on with this patient, and they figured his chances were less than 50%. This was somebody who'd been my soulmate, my best friend for 36 years, and we didn't know what it was and what could be done for it.
Sherry had a funny look on her face, and so when I caught Sherry by herself, I made my arrangements.
Then, as the family waits for yet another round of test results to come in, another bizarre symptom surfaces: hallucinations.
I was just looking around the room and stuff, and 3 construction workers came in there, and then they took out the window and put a new one in. And they finished up, they said goodbye, and he left.
And I said, honey, I don't think that would have happened in the ICU in the middle of the night. And he said, oh yes, you go ask. So I did ask, and of course, that wasn't the case.
The doctor told me that your brain will just create things out of nothing. And even though my wife and my daughter told me it was not real, I still believed it was real.
The medical team is perplexed by this sudden and seemingly unrelated symptom. They immediately order a second MRI to determine if there have been any significant changes in Bob's brain over the last 2 days. The findings are devastating.
The results of this MRI showed that there had been some lesions or scarring in the central part of his brain, and those weren't there just 2 days earlier.
The doctors speculate that the lesions are the result of a virus attacking Bob's brain. The damage could explain the loss of vision, sudden paralysis, and hallucinations.
All of the little white blood cells that battle viruses got rid of part of his brain along with the virus.
Bob's doctors immediately administer a high dose of steroids to reduce the inflammation in his brain. And while the steroids will not bring his vision back, they should help control the other symptoms.
He was on antibacterial, he was on antiviral, and he was on steroids.
Slowly but surely, Bob's body begins responding to the aggressive treatment.
I didn't get any better at that time, but I didn't get any worse.
Over the next several days, Bob rallies quicker than anyone expects. And by the end of the week, he's ready to begin inpatient rehabilitation. But the infection has taken a serious toll. Therapists will need to teach him how to walk and talk all over again.
You don't realize that you have to learn to walk again. And then they literally strap you to a walker, and the nurses got on both sides of you, and you get up and you walk.
After a 2-week period of time in inpatient rehab, he surprised us all by working hard and by walking out.
Bob's family is thrilled to see him moving about on his own and making strides in his speech therapy. But doctors also have some devastating news. It's unlikely he will ever regain the vision in his left eye. And to make matters worse, the medical team remains unable to make a conclusive diagnosis on his condition.
Bob and I were told that we should go home and we should live our lives and we shouldn't worry, and that if this was to happen again, it would be like lightning striking twice in the same place.
But the family's happy ending doesn't last long.
One day, after about 3 days we'd been home, I got a headache again. And it was pretty intense.
My mom and I were downstairs, and then we heard a huge thump. Immediately, we ran upstairs, and my mom opened the door, and there's my dad laying on the floor. We were terrified.
I was in the bathroom, and I fell, and I blocked the door so no one could get in.
We were terrified that as much as our worlds had changed already, they would change even more.
Bob Williams has been recuperating at home after surviving a devastating brain infection that cost him the vision in his left eye. But just when he thinks he's on the mend, Bob loses complete control of his body again. Terrified by the sight of her husband sprawled out on the bathroom floor, Sherry wastes no time rushing him back to the emergency room.
My greatest fear was that it would just happen over and over and over again until his body couldn't handle it.
The doctor immediately orders yet another MRI to see if there are any new lesions on his brain.
We were in the neurologist's office, and we all just listened to what we knew was very bad news.
Bob's neurologist informs the family that the MRI shows no new lesions. But the doctor is deeply concerned. He thinks Bob may have a rare form of vasculitis, an inflammation of the blood vessels in the brain's central nervous system generally caused by infection. This condition can be fatal, and the only way to make a completely accurate diagnosis is to perform a brain biopsy.
Vasculitis was, in our opinion, devastating because, for one thing, in order to prove that I actually had vasculitis, they needed to drill a hole the size of a quarter in my head, and I didn't care for that one bit.
Bob and Sherry are petrified, and before consenting to a biopsy, they decide to seek out a second opinion. Their next stop is the office of Dr. Andrew Slivka, a neurologist at Ohio State University.
I first saw him about 6-7 weeks after the onset of his neurologic symptoms. He and his family were a little distressed about what exactly was going on. There was some fear involved in terms of what was going to happen regarding the future.
As a first step, Dr. Slivka meticulously reads through Bob's case file. He then performs a full physical and neurological exam.
He had some abnormalities that were suggested by his history. He had significantly impaired vision in his left eye. He had some lower face weakness on the left side, a little bit of slurred speech. He had decreased coordination on the left side.
We were very worried it could be a chronic condition, and vasculitis was still in the picture as well.
But after reviewing another MRI and a CAT scan, Dr. Slivka is confident of one thing.
I thought vasculitis was not as likely a diagnosis. His brain scans didn't show that much in the way of damage, which you would have expected a little bit more. And his spinal fluid analysis was also not typical for vasculitis.
Having ruled out vasculitis and several other chronic conditions, Dr. Slivka begins putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And it isn't long before he comes to a surprising conclusion.
Based on Bob's imaging studies and also his spinal fluid analysis, I felt that Bob had acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, or ADEM.
Acute Disseminated Encephalomyelitis, or ADEM, is a neurological disorder that causes swelling in the brain and spinal cord. In healthy individuals, a fatty shield inside the brain called myelin covers and protects nerve endings. But in patients like Bob, an infection triggers the body's white blood cells to attack the myelin coating, leaving nerve endings exposed and vulnerable.
ADEM is a post-infectious inflammatory process that affects the central nervous system. It is generally monophasic, so there's generally just one episode.
Dr. Slivka suspects that Bob's bout with meningitis was responsible for his initial night sweats and light sensitivity. But it also opened the door for the acute disseminated encephalomyelitis.
So it's not the infection itself necessarily, it's a reaction of the nervous system and the immune system to the insult of the infection.
Each of the symptoms Bob presented over the past 2 months, including his drooping eye and partial paralysis, are a direct result of damage to specific parts of his brain caused by ADEM.
The blindness that he experienced was probably from inflammation of his optic nerve. His weakness was from involvement of the tracts that go from the brain to the spinal cord to control movement. The confusion and hallucinations were probably from involvement in a deep cell group called the thalamus.
Bob and his family are relieved to finally learn what's been turning their lives upside down for the last 3 months. But they can't help but wonder why it took so long to find the one doctor who could put it all together.
Over the 20 years or so I've been practicing, I've only seen a couple people with ADEM. Because we don't see this process very often, it can sometimes be below the radar.
ADEM is rare, and while nearly half of the patients diagnosed make a full recovery, severe cases can prove fatal. It's a difficult pill for the family to swallow, but their concerns quickly turn to what this diagnosis means for Bob's future.
He told us that it was a serious disease, but it was treatable.
Dr. Slivka instructs Bob to continue his course of steroids to reduce the inflammation in his brain. His hope is that with the proper response, he'll slowly be able to wean him off the drugs.
We wanted to sort of prolong this just to be absolutely certain that nothing else was going to happen.
We were very, very pleased to hear that, and when Dr. Slivka left the room, we cried.
Today, 1 month since he stopped taking the steroids altogether, Bob is markedly improved, but he still suffers from the effects of his ordeal.
He gets tired very easily. He's still not able to see from his left eye.
I may not get any sight in this left eye, but that would be a small price to pay for my health.
We're just being patient. As the doctors have indicated, it could take up to 2 years for him to, get back on his feet again.
It's a chapter in Bob's life that he looks forward to putting behind him. But when all is said and done, one thing's for certain. The ordeal has taught the family some valuable lessons.
Anything can happen. You don't really realize that until something happens to you personally.
Our philosophy is to live, laugh, and love, and we do it every day.
Hardly sick a day in his life, Bob Williams was forced to come to terms with his health in middle age. But young Ryan Poteet seemed to be on the front lines from the second he was born. In 1992, 23-year-old Diane Graham was living with her boyfriend, Howard Poteet, in Hamptons Roads, Virginia. They were just settling into their new life together when they learned that Diane was pregnant.
I was very happy, and I was looking forward to having a child that I can raise and love completely.
I was excited, and I was as ready as I thought I would be.
I was getting up in age, so I was wanting to be a grandmother.
Diane experiences an easy pregnancy, and in the summer, she gives birth to a baby boy they name Ryan.
When Ryan was born, he was 6 pounds 7 ounces and 21 inches long. As soon as they laid him in my arms, it was complete love, and I was going to do whatever to make his life wonderful. I was able to get up and walk to the nursery and look in the window, and all you could see was his face because they had him swaddled so tightly, and he was just laying in there sleeping peacefully.
That same evening, Diane says goodnight to her baby in the nursery, then decides to get some rest of her own. But a few hours later, she receives an alarming visit from the doctor on duty.
About 10 o'clock at night, a physician came into my room and woke me up, and he immediately asked me if I had done drugs while I was pregnant. And I told him plainly that I do not smoke, I had nothing to drink, and I don't do drugs. My first thought was, what's wrong with my baby? He said that there were some characteristics of Ryan that were not normal, that they were looking into, and he just wanted to rule out drug and alcohol abuse.
While the doctor has a host of questions for Diane, he has very few answers about her newborn son.
He explained to me that when a child was in vitro, that their hands are folded where their palms are to the forearms. Ryan's hands were still bent in that position. I don't think I slept the rest of the night. My mind was just going back and forth of what can it be and what's wrong with my baby, and it was terrifying.
The next morning, Diane's first order of business is to get a closer look at her son's hands.
I immediately laid him on the bed and completely unwrapped him. His hands were bent, just as the doctor had explained the night before. The first thought that went through my mind was, he's going to go through his life with his hands and not going to be able to use them.
That was the big conversation. Will he grow out of that?
The medical team has no idea what could be causing the unusual position of Ryan's hands, or how that may affect his ability to function. But they're confident that with a bit more time, they'll figure it out.
And then I tried to feed him, and he was having a hard time sucking. He would not grasp hold of a nipple of a bottle.
He kept his mouth wide open all the time, like he couldn't breathe very good. Of course, we knew something was not right.
2 days later, they discharged Diane, but Ryan remains under close supervision.
She worried about him a lot.
We would be at the hospital by 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and we would both stay there all day long until they made us leave in the evening.
After 5 days in the hospital, the doctors are no closer to a diagnosis, but decide Ryan's otherwise healthy enough to go home.
When we brought Ryan home, we left the hospital still not knowing anything as far as Ryan's condition.
They gave me no guidance, no suggestions, no thoughts or ideas, so I was pretty much just going at it blindly.
While the new parents are unsettled by the whole situation, Diane is happy to have her son home. But still concerned about Ryan's condition, she wastes no time making an appointment with a local pediatrician.
It was a long appointment because it was a full-blown physical. He checked everything from his eyes and his ears all the way down to his toes.
Unable to come to a conclusive diagnosis, the pediatrician sends Ryan for ultrasounds to look for any abnormalities in his organs. He also refers the family to a craniofacial clinic run by doctors specializing in congenital and acquired deformities of the skull, face, and jaws. Unfortunately, the earliest appointment is 3 months away.
It was a very hard time for me. I would wake up in the middle of the night and just sit up in bed and start to cry because I would have dreams that my baby would die.
While Diane and Howard anxiously wait for their consultation at the clinic, the new parents begin to notice other abnormalities in Ryan's appearance.
His legs and his feet had a little curvature to them. At first I thought maybe he was pigeon-toed.
His eyes were a little further apart than what you're used to seeing with any other child.
His little head was sunk in at the top, and his ears were sort of down lower than usual.
Finally, the long-awaited appointment at the craniofacial clinic arrives, and immediately the family is met by a team of specialists.
It's very scary when you have that many doctors looking at your child.
After performing a battery of tests, the doctors still have no idea what could be causing Ryan to develop in such an unusual way. But when a geneticist reviews Ryan's medical files more closely, he's shocked by what he discovers.
I remember he looked at me and he said they'd never seen anything like it before.
When Ryan Poteet was born, doctors knew almost immediately that something was wrong.
His hands were turned in, and his arms, they just didn't work right.
Now, 5 months later, their geneticist has made a shocking discovery in an old ultrasound that was taken when Ryan was just 3 weeks old.
He said, well, it plainly states in this report that your son has polycystic kidneys.
Polycystic kidney disease is a genetic disorder characterized by the growth of cysts in the kidneys that reduce kidney function, and in the worst cases, lead to kidney failure. It is extremely rare in children Ryan's age.
I was very upset that almost 3 months had passed before we even found out.
We were told there is a good possibility Ryan would have to someday have a kidney transplant. That kind of hit home a little bit.
Alarmed by the sheer number of cysts and Ryan's young age, the doctors immediately scheduled kidney function tests. Luckily, the results are encouraging.
His kidneys functioned at 100%.
But while Ryan's kidneys are functioning well, the doctors explain that they will have to monitor this condition for the rest of his life. Then, just as Diane and Howard are struggling to get their head around their son's kidney issues, the doctors hit the family with another devastating diagnosis.
The genetic doctor said that he has a syndrome called Melnick-Needle syndrome.
Melnick-Needle syndrome is a condition that causes deformities in the skeletal system, abnormally warping many bones in the body. Unfortunately, at this early stage, doctors can't predict just how severe Ryan's case will be.
The doctors thought maybe that he would be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life because the way his feet and legs are.
But much worse than the mobility issues, doctors warn the parents that many male babies with Melnick-Needles do not live past their first year.
It was very difficult because I still did not know if my child was gonna live or die.
None of us knew what to expect for the future. We were told multiple times from the doctors that we just have to watch him as he grows.
But while the syndrome can be devastating, Melnick-Needles can also be managed when monitored correctly. In addition to bringing Ryan in for biannual follow-ups at the clinic, the team encourages Diane and Howard to enroll their son in physical therapy so that he can immediately begin strengthening his legs.
This physical therapist worked with him very diligently. She had a walker for him that he could use to help support himself so he could walk on his own.
As the months roll by, Ryan proves that he is indeed a fighter. And by age 2, doctors and family alike are thrilled to see him walking on his own. But just as his parents are celebrating Ryan's progress, they discover another alarming symptom.
I noticed that he had a difficult time trying to hold on to a crayon or a pencil. The tips of his fingers looked like little balls. It made it very hard for him to hold on to small objects like a pencil or a crayon.
On the next of their seemingly endless trips to the craniofacial clinic, Diane mentions Ryan's newfound difficulty to the doctor.
The doctor said that the deformity with his fingertips was probably a trait of Melnick-Needles. It's just something that he's going to have to learn how to live with it.
And the bad news just keeps coming. As Ryan grows older, the warping of his bones begins to affect the size and shape of his mouth, causing a number of speech impediments.
They were concerned that he may have a cleft palate, but once they did further testing, they found out it was just a very high arch in his palate.
Over the next few years, Ryan works regularly with a speech therapist, and his ability to enunciate gradually improves. But as he grows up, it becomes clear to the little boy just how different he is.
Around 6, I started noticing that I had a syndrome. Like every morning I look in the mirror and I'm thinking, why do I look different than everybody else?
There was a noticeable physical difference in him than a normal child. Even in his school, he's always been the smallest kid.
Ryan may be smaller than the rest of the kids, but he shows incredible progress in physical therapy. And at age 5, he beats the odds by joining his neighborhood Little League team.
For me, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was just going out there and doing something that I love. It was a lot of fun when I played baseball.
While playing baseball means the world to Ryan, his physical limitations are never more obvious than when he's on the field.
He wasn't that fast. It was very noticeable with the curvature of his legs and the way his feet are positioned. When he would run, it looked like it was almost a struggle. And to be quite honest, at times it could look almost painful to watch him run.
Ryan and his parents assumed that all of these issues are directly related to his Melnick-Needles syndrome. That is until the fall of 1997, when they meet with a new geneticist at the Craniofacial Clinic, Dr. Virginia Proud.
I was just intrigued with trying to help us understand what Ryan's problems were, and most importantly, trying to get answers for his mom.
After giving Ryan a thorough exam, Dr. Proud makes it clear that she doesn't believe the little boy is suffering from the diagnosis everyone has accepted as fact all these years.
Generally, children with Melnick-Needles do not have polycystic kidneys. Most importantly, they simply don't have the significant hand, arm, lower leg changes that he had. He actually just said, forget Melnick-Needles, let's move on and see what's really going on.
Diane and I were scared maybe they're going to tell us something we may not know how to deal with.
Children with Melnick-Needles have very, very prominent eyes. But when you actually put the pictures side by side of a child with classic Melnick-Needles and Ryan, there just was not that pattern.
At 3.5 feet tall, Ryan is also significantly shorter than the typical Melnick-Needles patient.
That's a condition that does have skeletal problems, but generally not associated with significant short stature.
On top of that, the curvature of the bones in Ryan's fingers is not a traditional indicator of the syndrome.
His fingers themselves were asymmetric. The bones would angle, and each finger angled slightly differently.
After concluding her exam, Dr. Proud frankly discusses her concerns with the family. And while her hunch sends them reeling, she assures them that she'll get to the bottom of Ryan's case.
I was scared that, well, what if it's something worse than just Melnick-Needles?
Over the next few weeks, Dr. Proud pores over every detail in Ryan's medical file. And when she comes across a previous set of x-rays, a light bulb goes off.
There was 2 pages describing bone changes that Ryan had. There was one phrase that just stood out, and the term was serpentine. And that was applied specifically to the very thin bone, the fibula that runs down the side of the lower leg. Over the course of 20 years experience reading x-rays, I've only seen that term once or twice before. It's a very strong message that we need to listen to.
And when Dr. Proud enters each of Ryan's symptoms and test results into a genetic database, her suspicions are confirmed.
Looking at the pictures of children who really looked a lot like Ryan, adding that to his kidney problem and the characteristic hand, feet, and particularly serpentine fibula, both of which Ryan had. The problem was the condition, the Hajdu-Cheney syndrome.
Hajdu-Cheney syndrome is a rare bone disease characterized by a defect in a patient's ability to produce an unidentified protein that serves as a building block for the skeleton. In healthy individuals, these proteins act as a cellular glue, helping to maintain proper bone formation. But patients like Ryan lack the necessary protein that supports healthy bone development.
She took the information that she had on Hajdu-Cheney and said, this will explain his bone deformities. This will explain his polycystic kidneys. This will explain his short stature. It was very satisfying to know that we actually have a diagnosis that there is no doubt about.
Still, Diane has a tough time coming to terms with why it took so long to finally get to the bottom of Ryan's case. Dr. Proud explains to them that with little known about the syndrome, an accurate diagnosis can be extremely difficult.
There were many more people described with Melnick needles, and so actually some of the problems that Ryan had were consistent with that disorder.
Making the situation even more challenging is the fact that there are no more than 70 cases of Hajdu-Cheney syndrome known in the world today. And while Dr. Proud is optimistic about Ryan's prognosis, the future is still uncertain, as she cannot fully predict all of the complications he may experience.
As far as lifespan, I don't think there's enough information from the number of individuals that had this that we can even say. There's certainly nothing that says his lifespan is shortened, but he certainly also has enough medical problems that we need to be very vigilant in watching and caring for him.
Unfortunately, that means no more baseball for Ryan.
If Ryan continued to do dangerous things like play contact sports, it could have been fatal for him.
When I stopped playing baseball, I felt really bad because that's when I met all my friends, and that was the one thing that I loved doing.
He felt like, okay, now I'm an outsider. I'm no longer part of the group.
But Ryan, a self-proclaimed optimist, has found a new activity that is a bit easier on his body and just as rewarding.
I became really popular in my school and custom breakdancing.
He's a great dancer. He's fun to watch.
Given his bones and his structure and his neurologic system, who would think he could do that?
Today, at age 16, Ryan and his parents continue to manage the condition as best they can, taking each day as it comes.
He does still have to deal with a lot of pain with his back and with his legs, but he has learned to limit himself.
I am graduating in 2011, and I love to work on computers, so I plan on going to college after high school and becoming a computer technician.
We don't treat him as if he has a disability, and I think that's the biggest thing you can do to let them know that there's a lot of things they can do.